Tonight we are at the Perryville Battlefield State Park for the Ghost Walk hosted by the park manager, BRYAN. The Perryville battle took place October 8th of 1862. It was the largest and bloodiest Civil War battle in Kentucky with over 7,000 casualties. I will be wearing a microphone so we don't pick up too many people talking. The tour is 1 hour long. He will tell the history of the battle, and then we will walk the battlefield by lanterns and flashlight for ghost stories of things that happened there. It was $10 for each ticket, and listen close because I do capture what sounds like gunfire or cannons. And I pick up a few disembodied voices, but keep in mind it's very dark and it was such an amazing experience, we will definitely be going back next year. And because it was so long, I will be making this video in 2 parts, so I hope you enjoy. Everybody's gathering at the pavilion, getting ready for it. You ready, Captain?
I'm ready. Let's go do this.
My name is Bryan Bush. I'm the park manager for the Perryville Battlefield State Historic Site. I'll say that 5 times fast. And today I'm going to tell you a little bit of history about the battle itself, because I know some of you may have not been here before. So I'm going to explain a little bit about the battle. Now, on October 8th of 1862, you had Confederate General BRYAN. He was commander of the Army of the Mississippi, and he had roughly about 16,000 Confederate troops. He would be taking on Union General Don Carlos Buell's army. Now, Buell had about 55,000 Union strong under 3 corps. But unfortunately, only 1 corps would be engaged here. It would be the 1st Corps under Alexander McCook, and he had about roughly 20,000 Union soldiers. Now, you got to keep in mind, the day of the battle was almost 90 degrees. We were going through a drought. It had not rained here in over 6.5 weeks. And that's why this battle happened. It happened over water. You drove across it when you came into the battlefield today. That's Doctor's Creek. And it kind of meanders around the battlefield here. If you go to downtown Perryville, the Chaplain River still runs through it to this day. And that's what they were looking for, both armies. You also got to keep in mind the soldiers are dressed just like I am. I am an authentic outfit. It is 100% wool pants. You've got a wool shirt. You've got a wool vest. You've got a wool coat. And this is known as a frock coat. And this was what was used early in the war. They didn't come out with the shell jackets yet. And of course, the shoes that you see me wearing right now are boots, and they are wood-soled with peg nails. So, yeah, they're not Nikes back then, folks. So, yeah, so the Confederate soldiers, they were marching from Tennessee into Kentucky. The Union Army, they were gathering from all over the United States. They were gathering from Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin. We had them all the way from Minnesota coming here to this battle. And they marched from Louisville all the way here. Now, in that 90-degree heat in these wool uniforms, the Union troops here were inexperienced. Most of them were recruited just 3 weeks before the Battle of Perryville. They don't have a clue what they're doing. The Confederate soldiers that are marching up in this direction under Braxton Bragg, you better believe they knew what they were doing. They've been in the Army for 6 months, and they fought at the Battle of Shiloh in April of 1862. Now, the way this battle erupts is, as you drove into the front entrance of the park, that's where Confederate General Daniel Donelson's brigade fired the first shot to start this battle. And he's going to be coming across right in front of us here. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about him as he comes into what we call the field of death. And he comes up into that field of death, and he is being assaulted by the Union right and the Union left, and they have artillery. They see him in an open field. And within 45 minutes, he loses 33% of his entire brigade. So, Benjamin Cheatham, who is the divisional commander, he now has to send in another unit. And we're standing exactly where Confederate General Alexander P. Stewart was coming across in this direction. Now, unfortunately, he got tunnel vision. This happens in battle sometimes. It happened in Antietam. He saw a break in a wooden fence that came across this field, and he decided more than just push down the freaking fence. He takes all his men and puts them through the gap in the fence. Well, this takes time. So now Cheatham has no other choice but to put in his last reserve brigade, and that is Confederate General George Manny, who is off to my left. His 1,900 men are coming across this way and coming up towards Parsons Battery, which we'll cover in just a bit. And when he gets up there, you got to keep in mind, yeah, the Union had the high ground up there, but unfortunately they were green recruits and had no clue what they were doing. They had a battery up there, Parsons Battery, Captain Charles Parsons. He had 8 cannons, only 7 of them were able to unlimber at the time of the battle. And the Confederates started attacking that position, and the Union Army did 2 bayonet charges. They went really badly, because the Confederates just waited until the Yankees were in range and then mowed them down. So now, elements of the 41st Georgia and the 1st Tennessee come up the bluff of the hill, and that bluff still exists. And Union General James S. Jackson, who's the divisional commander on the extreme Union left, as the Confederates come up over the hill to completely surprise him, he looks to his left and he said, "I'll be danged that this is a peculiar situation." He was immediately hit with 2 bullets in the chest and died instantly. When the 123rd Illinois and the 105th Ohio, along with Parsons Battery, saw their divisional commander killed, they broke and ran. And now the Confederates come screaming down the hill, go through the cornfield, take on the 21st Wisconsin Infantry, and mow them down. They lose 59% of their entire regiment. Now they go up to Starkweather's Hill. The Confederates have been fighting for 5 hours on this end of the field. They are completely exhausted. They run out of steam. And the Yankees on this end of the field slowly fall back 1.5 miles to what's called the Dixville Crossroads, which still exists. On the other side of the field, I ought to come back during the daylight, there's a gravel road, and that will take you all the way to the very top where the Union Right is. And Mr. Henry P. Bottom's house still exists. He is the gentleman that owned most of this land when the battle occurred. And coming up over there is Confederate General Jones' brigade, Brown's brigade, Patrick Claiborne, Bushrod Johnson, St. John Lydell, Daniel Adams, along with our Austin sharpshooters. They put heavy pressure on the Union middle and right. That line collapses. And what ended up happening? The Yankees fall back 1.5 miles to the Dixville Crossroads. And what ends this battle is darkness. It got started about 2:30 in the afternoon, as you folks realize now. It gets dark about 5:30, 6 o'clock. So they break off the engagement. Now, Bragg realized by the end of the day, about 7:30, there's fresh Union units coming up the road. There's another 30,000 Union soldiers that have not even been engaged yet. So he wisely pulls out of here, falls back to Harrodsburg, links up with another Confederate general named Emmett Smith, falls back to Lexington, and then finally falls back into Tennessee itself. Well, Confederate General Braxton Bragg, he left all his dead and wounded on the battlefield. Imagine, folks, almost 90 degrees. Imagine what these bodies look like 3 days later. Hogs were eating them, buzzards were eating them, and they stayed on the ground because the Yankees considered the Confederates traitors. So they left them on the field. It was up to Mr. Bottoms, along with the town member here, to bury the dead. And the townsfolk buried, and we'll be coming up to it, is the mass grave. There are 400 Confederate soldiers buried in that mass grave. There are another 100 buried across the road in a grave marked by the federal government in 1923. The rest of them, your guess is as good as ours. We do not know where they all are. Yankees, they were buried by their comrades where they fell. But in 1865, the federal government passed a law stating that all Union soldiers should be buried in national cemeteries. So a gentleman by the name of Colonel Edmund Whitman was given the task to find the Union dead in Perryville. He managed to find 947 Union bodies. And he buried them in the Perryville National Cemetery out on Highway 150. Don't look for it, it doesn't exist anymore. There was a lawsuit in 1869 between the federal government and the landowners. Guess what? The federal government lost. So they had to dig up 947 Union bodies and bury them at the Camp Nelson National Cemetery in Jasmine County, which is where they are today. They're in Section E. So That's what happened there. And what I'm going to do is read you some after-action reports of what this battlefield looked like after the battle, when the Union Army was in possession of the field. And this is October 10th by a gentleman named William Stroud. He is with the 75th Illinois Infantry. He wrote to his sister about the experience on the battlefield and the horrible scene afterwards. He wrote, "It is impossible for a human tongue to describe the scene that followed. Suffice it to say that the 75th Illinois Regiment was in the battlefield for over 2 hours and suffered dreadfully. I cannot tell you how much of there was either 5 or 6 shot right by my side, but I didn't get a scratch. First there was John Brubaker. He was about 2 feet from me when he was shot, and 3 or 4 others that I didn't know. Little Frank Brown was killed by a ball falling right through his head. There were 6 shot, dead in our company, and killed and wounded. There were over 20 in our company. Just think of that, and thank God that I was spared. By Frank, I believe this was at least 50 balls passed within 2 feet of my head when we retreated. Retreat we did. Such a volley as followed us can never be described. Oh, Lee, you know him, Captain Barber, was wounded and died this morning. He was with me about 1 minute before. He was very brave, and when he was wounded, he said, 'Boys, take my sword, for I am gone.' Our former Captain Slagger is wounded, and we think unfortunately mortally. I don't know what else to write. I suppose, Jane, don't care about knowing how the battlefield looks right after the fight. Enough to say there is one dead Reb sitting 40 yards from here, and if there is one, there are at least 50. Within 3 miles, they lay on the ground naked, or nearly so in every direction. We went in the field about 1,000 men in our regiment, and in only 2 hours, only 240 men were left. I have seen all the fighting I ever want to see, not that I'm afraid, for positively, I was not. But to hear the groans and dying and the screaming, it is horrible." On October 10th, Chaplain William Smith of the 75th Illinois wrote in his diary about the aftermath. He wrote, "Reveille roused us at daybreak, and on getting to my feet, saw a dead horse a few feet away, and some newly made graves, just in the rear of where a cannon had been placed, the ground having been leveled so as to aim the gun accurately. Then, just beyond, Captain John Whalen of Company B got to his feet, out of his bed and blankets, and as our eyes met, I asked, 'What does this mean, Captain?' Glancing around, 'Oh, Chaplain, we have had a terrible battle.' And stepping near to him, he gave me the particulars, naming many of the wounded and killed, told where I would find the wounded at the house and barn just beyond. Without waiting for coffee or breakfast, I started, and all day went around the wounded and dying, and found a great many on beds of straw strung along the ground in a small field, for house and barns and sheds were full. Soon came in sight of the surgeons, where they were still amputating feet, legs, hands, and arms, as could be plainly seen by the bloody objects laying about. For 1 or 2 of our wounded men who were able to walk around, I soon found where the boys fought. And where about 2 or 3 o'clock I went to see for myself a burial party under the direction of Captain Robert Hill of Company I, was just getting the dead of our own regiment in a windrow, while some had already began to dig the long trenches for their graves. I took some name and company, about 45 side by side, Lieutenant Eels and Blaine making 47, and then carried to the John C. Russell House yard for separate and single graves. They went to get a drink of water from a creek beyond the battle line and found the way strewn with dead rebels, some bloated, but a horrible sight. And this is from G.W. Landrum of the 2nd Ohio Infantry. He writes, "I rode over to the battlefield the next day after the fight. I will not attempt to describe the horrible scenes I witnessed. Men with their heads shot off and mangled in every possible manner. The rebels stripped the dead and wounded. By the side of every one of our dead men, you could see an old pair of shoes and greasy, filthy pile of clothes. You have no doubt long since read descriptions of this fight, but no one can describe the scenes of that battle. I saw a rebel officer who had fallen on a fence that was still burning." October 9th, in the morning, the 52nd Ohio passed over the battlefield and saw bodies of men and horses scattered about everywhere. Every house and barn was filled with the maimed, the dead, and the dying. The battle is a red blossom of war, but the roots dark and bitter run beneath the tents, creep through the wards of the hospitals, and feel their way like the fingers of a hand, and all this ground we tread upon, save that only where lie our dead. As some of the members of the 52nd Ohio passed a building where the Confederates had left their wounded, they heard the cry of a rebel drummer boy. He was dying. Someone had leaned a broad plank against the side of the building where the boy lay to keep the water from the eaves of the house falling in his face, because rain began to fall after the battle. The boy called out in his delirium for his mother, saying, "Mother, dear mother, why don't you come and take me home?" When the members of the 52nd Ohio returned to the house a little later, the boy was still, because he had passed away. The Memphis Daily Appeal, published in the New Albany Daily Ledger, November 5th, 1862. I'll read you a passage from it. It says, "We learned that the sick and wounded Federal and rebel at Perryville, Harrodsburg, and Danville now number nearly 2,000, and that notwithstanding all the efforts put forth by the surgeons, there is considerable suffering among these sick and wounded for such necessary supplies as are required in the hospitals. As fast as the sick and wounded are able to travel, they are forwarded to Louisville and this city. Much and just complaint is made against citizens who have visited the battlefield at Perryville in search of their relatives buried there. It is said that in nearly every incident where the scantily covered graves are opened by these citizens, they are only partially filled up again. From this cause, the remains of the dead are left exposed, here an arm, there a leg, again a head, with his ghastly face from which the rotten flesh dropping, and upon all which the hogs feed at will. The thought of such things of itself is horrible. Its realization is terrible in the extreme. No more civilians should be allowed to open up graves upon the battlefield. It is a fit resting place for the brave men who poured out their lives' blood for their country. And such scenes of desecration upon its sacred soil are outrages which should never be tolerated." This was published in the Cleveland Leader newspaper on November 16, 1862. The field is still covered with the debris of the fight: dead horses, broken artillery wagons, haversacks, cartridge boxes, hats, shoes, remnants of clothing. In every field, and there are many, for the line of battle covered miles of territory. Fresh graves are abundant, and in places the soil assumes a darker hue, red with the blood of friend and foe. Since the fight, no rain has fallen, and these dark stains are still discernible. To the honor of human nature, our own dead are buried mostly where they fell, sufficiently deep to cover them from our eye. To its dishonor, the enemy are tumbled into shallow graves, and in many cave parts of the blackened remains are visible above the earth. Riding by where the enemy fell in numbers, I saw a hand, black with exposure, but still as delicate as that of a lady, resting on top of the parched earth, while the body to where it belonged had a thin covering of earth over it. The walnut-covered cuff of the coat, still around the wrist, showed it was a secession soldier, and a physician who was present with us pronounced the hand of a mere youth, which had never been hardened with labor. A few moments later, I saw another hand and part of the face protruding. In another field, and open one nearby, a swarm of long-backed and long-snouted hogs, common to this part of Kentucky, had rout into the thinly covered graves and were making banquet upon the human flesh. As we drove them away, they stood at the short distance and patiently waiting. And scarce had we turned the heads of our horses from this disgusting scene before they were again at the graves, curiously tearing limb from limb and devouring the half-corrupted flesh of those who but just a few days before stood in the pride of manhood, battling for home and honor. Near these graves are the bodies of horses, yet these scarce touch, the hogs preferring the human flesh to that of animals. A sight more horribly disgusting, human eye never ever should look upon. Occasionally we found a grave with a board at its head giving the name, the regiment, and the company of the dead occupant. And these were generally protected by a rail fence or covered with stones, with which every found abounds, to protect them from the hogs who, having tasted human flesh, are more ravenous than the hyena in their taste for human gore. Around the graves thus covered, myriads of flies, smaller it is true, yet resembling the green bottle fly, swarmed to the tops of the graves, and particularly the stones were black with them. and traversing the scene of slaughter, men, women, and children on foot, on horseback, and even carriages are met. And to the honor of womanhood be it said, that I saw a group of them with boards, and with their own fair hands, diligently engaged in scooping up the dirt that covered up the exposed parts of the victims of the great slaughter laid bare by shallow graves and the rooting of hogs. The woods are full of acorns, walnuts, buckeyes, and corn is scattered over the fields, and yet fond of the hog as of these, he scarcely touches them, the human banquet being chosen above all vulgar and common food. That just give you a little bit of the scene, what it looked like here after the battle. Just to give you more ironic, these guys, like I said, were fighting in almost 90-degree heat the day of the battle with no water. They're wearing pure wool like I am, and we're wearing about 50 pounds worth of equipment. The rifle alone weighed about 10 pounds. Guess what it did 3 days later? Rain, then it turned to snow.
Oh.
So these poor guys that have been still out here, and by the way, Union General Don Carlos Buell, Mr. Wonderman himself, he decided to leave the medical wagons in Louisville. He thought they would slow down his army. They didn't get here until a week later. So these poor regimental surgeons were dealing with whatever they had on hand. So yes, some men were suffering out here without having chloroform. And like I said, it snowed, and it snowed about 4 inches out here. So now the men were dying of heat exposure. Now they're dying of hypothermia. Yeah. So I'm going to give you a little bit of some of the ghost stories now, and I'm going to tell you about in town. If you haven't been to downtown Perryville, I highly recommend you go there. The place is called Merchants Row, and it is almost completely intact the way it was during the Civil War. And there was street fighting and skirmishing going into this town itself. And there are several buildings there. One of them is called, it used to be called Itchy Dog Antiques, but it's now changed its name to Chapman River Antiques. And it's owned by good friends of mine, John and Silly Hensley. And it is haunted. It has been investigated. There are 2 Confederate soldiers that haunt the basement. Now, even before that, and I am dating myself, it used to be known as the Battlefield Restaurant, home of the Battle Burger. And during the reenactment, on the actual day itself, the town was filled with people. And story after story after story, they said a little boy with a gray kepi, a white shirt, gray pants, brogans, which is a type of Civil War shoe, would come up to the guests in the streets and saying, "Excuse me, I'm really thirsty. Can you get me a drink of water? I'm really thirsty." So the folks would go into the Battlefield Restaurant and said, "There's a little boy out here. He says he needs water." And then the folks that own Battlefield Restaurant would start laughing, and they'd be like, and the folks would be like, "Why are you laughing at me? This boy needs some water." And they said, "Congratulations, you just met your first ghost." He does that every time. He'll ask guests for water. Well, he's also been seen underneath the town. There's a cave that literally runs underneath the town. It opens up where the Kirkland Park, the Parks Kirkland home or Parks house is, and the Carrot Parks house. And I'll tell you another story. He's also been seen in town. A friend of mine owned the old Opera House, and they turned it into a bookstore. They lived upstairs while the store was downstairs, and then there was an extra room in the back in case they had guests come over. And when they moved in the first week, their store, as you came in through the door, there was a bell. So when you opened the door, the bell would go click, 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 click. They knew somebody had entered the store. Well, at 2 o'clock in the morning, they heard ting-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling-a-ling. They're like, "Uh-oh, somebody's broken in the store." So they'll go downstairs, and then they'll go out, check the front door. It's completely locked. The deadbolt's fixed. Nobody's in there. So they go back to sleep. A couple weeks later, 2 o'clock in the morning, bing, yin, 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 yin. Yeah, boy. So they go back downstairs, check the door, it's locked, and they finally had a little discussion saying, "All right, whoever this is, quit. So, for a while it quit. And then they had a friend that stayed over during the reenactment, and she stayed in the back room, and the same thing, 2 o'clock in the morning. Ting-ling-ling-ling-ling-ling-ling-ling. So she woke up from the back room before the folks upstairs had woken up yet, and she decided to go out into the front room, and then she looked, and there it was in a window, the Confederate boy staring at her with a bluish green haze around him. I looked straight in there. She got her clothes, left. Bye. She was done. So that's where he's been seen. Now, this was just last year. We had some tourists that came in, and they didn't know Perryville rose up their sidewalks at 5 o'clock every day. So there was nothing for them to do, but they decided to go ahead and walk around. Now, the Carrot Parks house was used not as a field hospital. It was actually used by the Union surgeons. All the Union surgeons of the different divisions and corps made that their headquarters. And I knew this information, but these folks didn't that were walking the town. And the gentleman said, you know, we were walking downtown last night, about 8 o'clock at night, and we went by the Carrot Parks house, and in the right window, we saw a desk, a really nice desk with a candle on it, and there was a gentleman there sitting, writing, and doing paperwork. He would stare up occasionally, keep on doing writing, and it'd go like, that's really cool that they had reenactors out that late for the public to see. And he didn't know who he was or what he looked like, and I said, well, describe him to me. He said, well, he had a blue coat on, and it had shoulder boards over here, and he had a hat on, and it said MS on it, and then the shoulder boards had an MS on it, and he was wearing green trim on his uniform. And I said, what color was it again? He said, blue. I'm like, uh-oh. And I said, you just seen yourself a Union surgeon. The surgeons back then, the MS stood for medical surgeon. The green trim was to indicate he was a surgeon. So, yeah, I said, congratulations, you just saw your first ghost while you were downtown. So, if there's no questions or any inquiries or anything like that, let's go hit the field itself.
Were the hogs around here wild? Or?
Yes, there were wild hogs. Mm-hmm. And you know, it's so funny. I kid you not. If you show up at 2 o'clock at the battlefield every day, the buzzards will start flying. Now, whether they've been carrying that thing generation after generation saying, hey, pickings were good here at one time. Who knows? But they do show up. The buzzards show up here every day at the same time. I'm going to get a swig here, and then we'll take off for the battlefield.
All right, we're going into the battlefield.
While she was making the candle, she always knows when she's done making the candle, she turns off the wax melter. And she made sure she turned it off. And she does it all the time. She came back in the room, someone had turned on the wax and wax poured all over her floor. Somebody had turned it back on and opened up the spout. So there you go. And everybody in town said, congratulations.
Flashlight. I remember, I was mainly raised back home in Puerto Rico. So, you know. Oh no. Turn red on. Is that better? Walk across the bridge.
And when we have large groups, like school children and military staff ride, we'll show the movie.
Yep, here, babe. Definitely dark, huh? Mm-hmm. Let me borrow your flashlight, Captain. That's not bright enough for me. Dark. You want my red flashlight? What was that?